Let's talk about the Gestalt laws of grouping. These laws of grouping actually come from Gestalt psychology, which is actually a lot bigger than what we're going to talk about here. And indeed, there are more laws than the ones mentioned here. However, we're going to go through these because I think that they're very interesting, and they really help us understand how placement of things on a spreadsheet and how charts and graphs kind of affect how we understand information. So if we understand these patterns, we can use them to our advantage. So let's talk about similarity. So similarity deals with elements which share the same characteristics. So in this case, I've listed shape, color, and size, but it could be really any type of characteristic. When we see that, we often see those, when we see groups of similar characteristics of shapes, we often perceive them as being part of a unified group. For instance, if I were to point your attention over here at this banquet hall and I said, well, how many groups of shapes do you see? Most people will say that we see one group here, another group here, and finally one group here. Proximity deals with shapes that are close together, and often clusters of shapes are perceived as being part of their own group. So let's take a look at this chart. It's very zoomed out. How many groups do you see? Well, if we zoom it in, and I asked a few people, some people said they saw 3, so I've sort of highlighted them down here. Some people said they saw 4. Now, there's no real correct answer on this. The point being is that whether you see it like this or like this, it sort of affects how we perceive it. And our own personal biases, our own background affects how we perceive it. I can't tell you why some people thought this square by itself was not part of the larger group. I don't really know, but what I should be aware of is that everyone interprets it differently. And in fact, the scale, zooming in versus zooming out, also affects how we interpret things. So let's take a look at this chart right now. We see that there's a wide difference between yes and no respondents. But if we show the values of that difference, we don't see it's very big. And what happens if we start the chart at 0%? So the research tells us that we should always start our bar and column charts at 0%. And here's the reason why. Because the difference here is that of 2 percentage points. And yet what the chart shows is actually a seemingly stronger difference. And that is because it starts at 45%. So in not showing it at 0%, we visually overstated that proportionate difference. Here's a common example that you can find on the internet of when people talk about data visualization. It really borrows from what we talked about previously. In this case, the chart wasn't started at 34%. And so the difference here of 4.6% is somewhat overstated. So closure allows us to perceive shapes and objects as complete forms even when we don't have enough information there to understand what we're looking at. So let's take a look at this. Most of us look at that shape on the left and we say, hey, that looks like a circle. And we look at the one on the right and we think, that's kind of square-like. So that's closure at work. It's taking shapes that we already understand and forming them in our brains. One really common example of this is Kinesis triangle. And here, no triangle is actually being drawn, but our brains are visually placing triangles, or at least creating the contours to triangles. Common grouping concerns our ability to view connected objects as single uniform shapes. So let's take a look at this cross over here. How many lines make up this shape? Most people would say 2. Some people might say 4. I don't think anyone would look at this right line right here and say that this is made up of 2 connected lines. We just don't really see the segment because they're connected, right? So in common grouping, we view things as continuous and connected. And finally, continuation allows our minds to perceive overlapping shapes and forms as being uninterrupted. For instance, when we look at this triangle with a line through it, we perceive it as a triangle with a line through it. We don't perceive it as a trapezoid adhered to a line with a triangle on top, and we don't view it as one line here with a missing segment right here that this line cuts through. Generally, we look at this and we say, hey, it's a line on top of a triangle, and that's continuation.